History is usually told as a highlight reel of triumphs, right? It's a chronicle of revolutions, of bold leaders, and relentless human progress. But today, we're going to examine a quieter, much more insidious societal disease. We aren't looking at why nations rise, but rather, why they surrender. Welcome to our explainer. Today, we're exploring the architecture of surrender, an examination of exactly what happens when a collective consciousness simply decides to give up. It's a profound mystery when you really stop to think about it. Why do entire societies resist change, even when a way out, a clear economic or political lifeline, is right there for the taking? To understand this, we have to step back with a bit of clinical detachment. We need to zoom out from the individual, everyday tragedies and really ponder the collective tragedy of nations that, for whatever reason, refuse to save themselves. So, here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the anatomy of surrender. Second, encoding cultural defeatism. Third, the architecture of passivity. Fourth, the economics of the defeated. Fifth, we'll trace some historical patterns of fatalism. And finally, we'll end on engineering cultural hope. We're going to take a journey from the very psychological roots of giving up all the way to the macroeconomic fallout of cultural defeatism. Let's dive in. Part 1. Anatomy of surrender, the micro roots of giving up. To understand how a whole nation throws in the towel, we first have to establish the behavioral baseline of a single individual. We actually need to set our stage back in the 1960s. Psychologists Martin Seligman and Stephen Meyer ran these classic experiments where they placed dogs in a chamber and administered inescapable shocks. Later on, they moved these same dogs into a box where they could easily just jump over a small barrier to escape the shock. But they didn't. They just lay down and took it. This is what we call learned helplessness. When an individual faces uncontrollable trauma, whether that's inescapable literal shocks, or maybe a student whose genuine effort is completely ignored by a rigid grading system over and over again, the very instinct to try is extinguished. The environment literally teaches them that effort is just wasted motion. Now, the outward symptoms of this condition look like a total lack of motivation, an inability to learn from success, and a profound emotional numbness. People just look checked out. But here's the fascinating part. That numbness is a complete illusion. Medical science later proved that beneath this passive, apathetic exterior, internal stress hormones like cortisol are absolutely raging. This proves that passivity isn't some peaceful acceptance of fate. It's actually a deeply unnatural, agonizing state of chronic distress. Part 2. Encoding cultural defeatism, from individual trauma to societal norm. But what happens when that agonizing state transcends just a single battered mind? We have to shift from the micropsychology of an individual to the macro-sociology of an entire resigned population. Now, in behavioral economics, we talk a lot about individual biases. Think of Daniel Kahneman's prospect theory or bounded rationality. These are basically isolated personal misjudgments we make when we're calculating risk. But collective resignation, that is a much heavier inherited disease. It's a shared societal fatalism. It is this deeply entrenched inertia that doesn't just ruin a personal stock portfolio, it actively blocks large-scale national progress across the board. So, how does this actually happen? How does one generation's trauma somehow become a nation's destiny? Well, it happens through mechanisms of cultural transmission. The sociologist Emil Durkheim spoke of the collective consciousness, this set of shared emotions and beliefs. Defeat literally gets embedded into social memory. Language itself starts to construct a reality of limited possibilities. Phrases like, well, that's just the way it is, become unofficial national anthems. Tradition passes down these cultural molds, and eventually group identity unifies people not around their shared triumphs, but around their shared trauma and perceived incompetence. This cultural transmission culminates in what sociologist Pierre Bourdieu called habitus. Habitus refers to the deep reservoirs of knowledge and tendencies that we inherit from our culture. It subconsciously dictates our attitudes and what we think our limitations are. So the absolutely crucial takeaway here is this. Collective defeatism isn't some conscious choice that millions of people wake up and make every morning. It is an automatic, inherited reflex of a specific social class or nation. They are systematically conditioned to expect failure. Part 3. The architecture of passivity, how institutions trap us. You see, failing political and social institutions don't just sit back and observe this helplessness. They actively cultivate it. I want you to consider the sheer weight of this quote from Martin Seligman. He says, a fundamental sense of well-being relies significantly on our capacity to control our surroundings and acknowledging that we have such capacity. When institutions intentionally strip away this sense of control, they aren't just being inefficient, they are systematically dismantling the very foundation of societal well-being. Unstable or autocratic political institutions actively reinforce this public passivity. They effectively place their own citizens in an inescapable environment that perfectly mirrors the psychologist's shock box we talked about earlier. From the autocratic terror of Nazi Germany to the labyrinthine, totally unresponsive bureaucracies of modern states, regimes manipulate public passivity to consolidate their own control. They teach the citizen that resistance is utterly futile, which of course allows atrocities and corruption to flourish entirely unchecked. Part 4. Economics of the defeated. The cost of collective surrender. Let's broaden our lens to the economic sphere for a moment. When a nation is burdened with a defeated mindset, standard rational choice theory simply falls apart. This academic model right here maps out the cyclical trap of culturally learned helplessness. You start with external political instability and weak systems. That leads directly to an individual loss of motivation. That collective pessimism then spirals into low economic growth, severe poverty, and the flight of skilled labor. Because the culture fundamentally believes no action will change the outcome, no structural economic reforms can ever actually take root. The symptoms of this kind of ailing economy are incredibly stark. You'll see pervasive collective pessimism, an absolute collapse in entrepreneurship, and defensive capital hoarding. It's much like how Wall Street's VIX fear index measures volatility in financial markets, except here, inherited cultural fear is what dictates market participation. People act out of a deep-seated fatalism. They actively choose inaction to protect what little they have, which virtually guarantees long-term economic stagnation. Part 5. Historical patterns of fatalism. The global footprint of defeat. Now, this isn't just some abstract academic theory. It's a remarkably consistent historical pattern. Look at this timeline. From the 1960s onward, Nigeria's government's failures cemented widespread powerlessness, entirely neutralizing their vast natural wealth. From the 1980s, Turkey faced these periodic, decadal economic crises, creating a deep societal exhaustion where trust in any structural reform just eroded away. In Bolivia in the 2000s, educators actively refused financial incentives to improve student performance. They were entirely convinced that fighting the systemic poverty of their students was a futile endeavor. And mind you, this isn't just a phenomenon in developing nations. Multi-generational poverty in places like Ethiopia yields the exact same behavioral paralysis as systemic shocks in Europe or North America, where threats to comfortable stability trigger institutional helplessness and massive protests, like Occupy Wall Street or the French pension riots. Part 6. Engineering cultural hope, breaking the cycle of helplessness. But history is not solely a record of despair. If helplessness can be learned, well, resilience can be learned too. We need to pivot now from diagnosing the disease to writing out the behavioral prescription. The ultimate antidote to learned helplessness is learned hopefulness. Psychologist Carol Dweck made some profound findings showing that if we intentionally design systems where failure is treated as a lack of effort rather than a permanent, unchangeable lack of ability, we can actually rebuild resilience. We have to purposefully craft environments that prove, unequivocally, that our actions yield tangible, positive consequences. For the individual level, Martin Seligman provided a fantastic cognitive blueprint called the ABCDE model of learned optimism. First, you recognize the adversity. Then, you identify your pessimistic belief about it. Next, you note the consequence, those heavy feelings of surrender. Then comes the critical step, disputation. You actively generate hard counter-evidence to your own fatalism. And that leads to energization. Breaking this individual conditioning is the absolutely necessary first step before a whole nation can begin to heal. However, individual therapy just isn't enough to cure a societal disease. True national recovery requires completely dismantling that structural architecture of passivity we talked about. We must implement macro-level cures. We need to mobilize the idealistic segments of society, the artists, the engineers, the anthropologists. We have to activate cultural institutions to basically re-educate the populace towards personal agency. And above all, we must guarantee independent, transparent, and accountable governance that actually truly serves the public interest. Which brings us to a rather heavy yet vital final reflection. I want you to look at the systems around you right now. Your workplaces, your local political bodies, your educational systems. Are our own modern institutions actively teaching us to be helpless? Understanding the answer to that question is the very first step toward reclaiming our collective agency. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.